follow Dee. Any of the kids 1st through 5th grade would follow her. And that would include you guys. I didn't see anybody else. We'll give them a chance to do that. I guess since you guys are all here, that means none of you won the Powerball lottery. Is that right?
We'll check the offering plate soon.
It was a hopeful week for a lot of people this week. They had their hearts set on this lottery thing. And last night around 10:05, they were all disappointed except for one. And that's the way it works when we put our hope in the wrong things. So we want to talk today about what Abraham put his hope in and see how his hope can guide our hope. So we can go ahead and do the first slide. It's hard to separate hope from faith. It's hard to define hope apart from faith. And I just thought that picture was funny. I don't exactly remember why I put it up there. But faith is believing that you can move a mountain. I think hope is why we have faith. And there's different kinds of hope. Hope is this thing. Like we read earlier in Genesis, the hope of Abraham. His hope was set on this promise that God gave him. This promise of being a great nation. That God would bless him. That God would give him the land. And that was all out in the future. And by faith, Abraham believed that and started walking in that direction. And we remember from last week, Abraham didn't have a GPS, so he got lost a few times. But he kept turning back. He kept turning towards the hope that God had given him. But there's two different kinds of hopes. We can hope in things that are humanly possible. And we can hope in things that are impossible for humans, that are only possible with God. So we'll have how about a little quiz? If I say, hope you enjoy this sermon, humanly possible or only possible with God? I hope the Cubs win the World Series this year. I hope I can pull this calf. That guy. Humanly possible if you're maybe Scott Brandon back there. Or, I hope my faith is strong enough to move a mountain. Only possible with God. When we put our hope in God, we're putting our hope against spirits of other spirits, like fear and confusion. We put our hope in God. It is trusting in God, not ourselves. But to do that, we have to grow in hope. To do that, it's like a seed growing in the garden. Has anybody planted their gardens yet? Has anybody seen green above the dirt yet? Romans 5:3-5 says, "Not only so, but we also rejoice in our suffering, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom He has given us." So in order to get to hope, we have to go through a few things. It starts with suffering. How did Abraham suffer? 75 years before Abraham got a promise from God, he never had a child. And then for 15 years afterwards, he didn't. But he persevered. And a lot of times suffering can produce two different things. Suffering either produces perseverance or it produces giving up. And a lot of us get there. We're suffering and then we give up. We don't get to see all the benefits that can come. Perseverance, if we keep persevering, it produces in us character. But if we keep giving up, what does that produce in us? I don't really know if there's one word that we can just use to describe that, but it's sort of the opposite of hope. It's giving up. It is not having character. But constantly growing in character produces in us hope. And like I said, hope is hard to define. And I found a picture that maybe tells us a little bit about hope. It says, every night we go to bed without any assurance of being alive the next morning, but we still set our alarm clocks. It's hard to separate hope from faith. Hope is what fuels faith. Faith springs from our hope. If we don't have hope, we won't have faith. There would be no reason to. We have a hope in eternity, and so we live our lives in the present by faith. Abraham had a hope that God would truly make him a great nation, that God would give him a son. And because he had that hope, he lived by faith. And then he messed up. But he still had that hope, so he turned. Remember, he stopped in Haran for a while. But he had faith. He kept going. Passed right through the promised land into Egypt. But he still had his hope, and he turned. And then he kept kind of waffling back and forth in between faith and disbelief or something to that effect. And things kind of kept getting in the way. And he would get discouraged, but he kept his hope. For us, a lot of times things get in the way too. We have a boulder right in the middle of the road, something that stands in our way. We look at it and we say, well, I can't get through that. But we know that God's hope is on the other side. This future that God has for us, somewhere down there at the end of the road, but all we can see right now is a roadblock. And we think to ourselves that we can't get through that. For Abraham, the thing that got in his way was age. Do you remember how old Abraham was when he had a child? And 100, and Sarah was 90. He could have given up if he didn't have the hope that God had given him. What gets in the way of our hope? Maybe a better question is, what is our hope? What is out there in the future that God has promised us? Both in this church and in our lives, God has promised us an abundant life. God promised us first an eternal life in heaven, but God promised us abundant life here on earth today. Are we still seeking after that hope? Or have we given up? When we're suffering, is it producing in us character and perseverance, or are we giving up? Are we giving up hope? Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know," God speaking, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a hope and a future, plans to prosper you and not to harm you." That's what God's future is. But sometimes stuff gets in the way. Sometimes it's things that are outside of our control. Events happen in our life that are discouraging. Bad things happen. And it's hard to believe that God has a hope and a future for us. Sometimes those things that happen within us. Attitudes of fear. If we're afraid of where God is leading us, or if we're discouraged, or maybe our own, hard to use the word besides attitude, but when we feel like Pharisees, when we are Pharisees. That gets in our way of following after God. The way that God's leading us is the straight and narrow path. But how do we break through? How can we get further along that road and closer to Christ? Well, up on the screen is going to be one way we can do that. Would that work? Just karate chop right through it? Some obstacles are too big for us to do that to. They're bigger than us. They're so big that it takes God's help. And God has told us that. God won't give us anything that we can't handle with God's help. We can try to do it on our own. We can try to just beat the boulders with our hands, but that's not going to end well for us. We have to have faith. Faith is what gets us through these things that get in our way on the way to hope, on the way to the future that God has given us. Living by faith is what will get us through. We see the wall and we can either say, I quit. Can't get through that. Or we can keep going. A lot of times we want to give up. Things are hard. Things can be hard for a long time. We can feel like we're beating our heads against the wall, trying to get things done, get things moving, get things going towards God's future. But we can't give up. I don't remember if we had the picture up on the screen a few weeks ago or not, but on Facebook somebody sent a picture, and it was a guy who he was under the ground mining for gold or something, and he had a pickaxe and he was digging, and the guy at the bottom of the screen had given up, and he didn't realize that he was about a foot away from the gold. And that reminded me of something that I've been talking with different people about the church here. It was about the Battle of Jericho. In the Battle of Jericho, God told Joshua and the others to walk around Jericho every day for 6 days. And on the last day, they walked around it 7 times. And then the walls came tumbling down. And I wonder how many of us have given up on day 6, not realizing we are one day away from victory, and we give up. And the way that happens is we have a weak link. We have sick faith for a time. Sick faith is a reliance upon a fearful and uncertain natural hope that is circumstantially driven and not faith driven. And yes, I completely stole that from a commentary. But faith is weak when it allows itself to be influenced by its surroundings. God gave us faith for a reason, so that we can ignore the circumstances around us and keep moving forwards. When Abraham relied on himself, things didn't go very well. We can walk our way through Abraham's life and think, when he was in Canaan, there was a drought. So what idea does he come up with? Instead of staying here where God has promised, why don't I keep moving and go to Egypt? And while he's in Egypt, he thinks, boy, it's dangerous here. Perhaps I can save my life by saying that my wife is my sister. And then later he does it again. And then later when God promised him a child, and the child didn't come right away, Abraham again just comes up with a bright idea on his own. And again, it doesn't work out very well for him. And ultimately, God makes promises that end up coming true. Ishmael even was told he would be the father of many nations, just like Abraham, or just like Isaac. But the thing about Ishmael, when that promise came true, it was many different nations who all became Israel's enemy. Abraham's bright idea caused thousands of years of trouble. If we know our history, we realize Israel kept fighting these people over and over and over again. And today the descendants still surround Israel because of that one mistake, that moment of sick faith, that moment of coming up with your own bright idea instead of following after God. So one of my questions today is, are you relying on yourself or are you trusting in God? What are we hoping for? What are we doing to get there? In order to get there, in order to get to this hope that God has promised us, we need to strengthen our faith. And to do that, that involves some heavy lifting. Has anybody ever tried to start a new exercise program? And how does it work? After about a week, you want to give up, right? Has anybody made it past that week? Does it get easier? It does. I think it gets easier. I remember the first day I went to soccer practice. It was 9th grade, it must have been. 8th grade, something like that. And we ran. And this is what the first 2 practices of the year are. It's nothing but running, and we're going to see who quits. And I didn't quit, and it hurt. And the next day it hurt more, and the next day it hurt more than that. But eventually it became easier to run. And I think today if I started running again, it would hurt. And it might take a few weeks to get where it doesn't hurt so much anymore. But that's the way our faith is. Every time we have an opportunity to use our faith, we can either use it or we can sit back and stare at the boulder in the way and say, there's nothing I can do. Every time we fight for our faith, we get stronger. Every time we get stronger in faith, we're better prepared for the next time. If we keep our eyes on God's hope, despite whatever suffering might come about, Hebrews tells us that we have to run with perseverance the race that's marked out for us. If we run with perseverance, that means that we are suffering. And that suffering is producing perseverance, and that perseverance is producing character, and that character produces hope. But it's only if we don't give up. We've all wanted to give up at some point. Some of us have tried to build our faith many times, and it's hard. It's hard to trust God. But when we do it once, it becomes easier the second time. And then it becomes easier after that. And then we start to see God's hand at work all around us. We were talking today in Sunday school about miracles. Why doesn't God do miracles today? Well, God does. We just don't notice it. A lot of us. A lot of us struggle to see God's hand. And I think that's because we haven't strengthened our faith in certain areas. We trust in ourselves. And when we get to where we can see all that, we keep getting encouraged, and it builds on each other. It keeps building because our faith works in us also. God works in us if we let God do that. But in order to do that, we have to go and do something. Doing something's hard, isn't it? When we want to sit around and do nothing, to get up and go do is hard. But that's the way our faith is. Once we strengthen our faith, what good? What good is it if we don't go and do something? I had a friend of mine in high school who was a bodybuilder. And he lifted weights all the time. He had the big pretty muscles and stuff. But when it came time to move our youth minister's house into an apartment or vice versa, whatever it was, he struggled. because he never did anything. He just lifted. When it came time to move into bed, he couldn't do it. He said it was, different muscles or something like that, but that's how it is. Some of us, all we do is we practice our faith, and we don't actually go and do. A lot of us take in all this knowledge and all this spiritual stuff. At church, we come in on Sunday, we come in on Wednesday, we learn, but we don't do. If we do that, we're just like a bodybuilder who can't really do anything. It looks great. It looks great to have perfect attendance beside your name, but you've got to do something. We have to go and to do. We can't just spend all of our time strengthening ourselves for no reason. God has a plan for us. Remember that plan, that hope and the future that God has? What happens if we don't do it? What happens if I don't fulfill the plan that God has for me? Who suffers? It's not just me. Every one of you will suffer too. And if you don't fulfill God's plan in your life, I'm going to suffer. And everyone in your Sunday school class will suffer. And your family will suffer. When you are following after God, you can lead others there also. But you have to stretch yourself. When we were running, or when I was running cross country, which again is a long time ago, we had to run different. In practice, we had different types of running that we had to do. The race is 3.1 miles, and every day in practice, we didn't run 3.1 miles. Some days in practice, we ran 6 miles, a little slower. Sometimes we ran a half a mile faster. Sometimes we ran a quarter mile really fast, and we would do it over and over and over again to get better. If we want to stretch our faith, I think we have to pray for the impossible. God's future for us seems impossible. These things that God has planned for us, for Abraham it was impossible. There's no way he could do it on his own. We have to pray for the impossible. What impossible thing is God bringing to your mind? What dreams have you had that you could never fulfill on your own? Where do you see God leading this church? Does it seem possible to get there? Or does it seem like there's something in the way? Jesus said in Mark 10:27, "With man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God." Do you guys believe that? Then let's do something about it. When something seems impossible, let's pray about it. When that mountain seems too big to move, let's use our faith to move it. Let's take this church to the future that God has for it. But to get there, we have to go where God is leading us. For some of us, that means taking the first step. First step up the aisle and into the baptistry. For some people, it is joining the church. Join the fellowship here. Decide, I'm willing to commit myself to serving in this place. You can count on me. For others, it's maybe dealing with a sin in your life. Whatever it is, we have to do something. We have to make that decision. We have to go and to do. And as we all stand, would you guys mind to go ahead and stand? We'll have the invitation and final hymn. We do all these things. We have this faith to see these obstacles and to get through them because of Christ. If it was not for Christ, we could not do it. If it wasn't because He lived, we couldn't do it. If you have a decision to make or a commitment that you need to make, you can come forward during this song.